The alarm was already screaming when I reached my desk. Not the soft chime of a routine update. Not the amber pulse of a minor border incident. This was the red, relentless wail of a protocol breach, the kind that had not sounded in my lifetime, the kind that older ambassadors spoke about the way people speak about disasters they were lucky enough to miss. I am Ivrath, Senior Ambassador of the Conclave's 7th diplomatic ring, and in 42 years of service, I had never once heard that alarm. I stood in the doorway of my chamber, still holding my morning tea, and I watched the lights on the wall turn the color of blood. Let me tell you something about the conclave before I tell you what happened. Next, we are by any honest measure the most sophisticated gathering of minds in the known galaxy. 41 species bound together across 3,000 light-years of shared space, operating under a charter that has not needed revision in 600 years. We have solved wars that lasted centuries. We have mapped the edges of the observable universe. We have cured diseases that wiped out entire civilizations before we arrived to offer a hand. We are, in short, very good at what we do, and what we do above all else is maintain order. The Dormancy Accord is the oldest law in the Conclave Charter, older than the trade agreements, older than the weapons treaties, older even than the Founding Council itself, because the Accord was written before the Council existed by the same beings who then created the Council to enforce it. The law is simple. There is a world in the outer spiral, arm, third planet from a yellow star, unremarkable in nearly every way except one. It holds a young species, warm-blooded bipedal, curious to a degree that borders on compulsive. They call themselves humans. The law says, do not contact them. Do not provoke them. Do not let them know the galaxy is populated and watching, and has been watching for 800 years. Maintain the silence. Maintain the distance. File the quarterly reports and leave them alone. No one debates this law. No one questions it. It simply exists the way a foundation stone exists, unremarked, because everything is built on top of it. I had, in 42 years, filed 672 quarterly surveillance reports on the human home, world, population counts, conflict assessments, technological development indices. Every one of them stamped dormant, filed, archived, forgotten. I cannot tell you what their cities look like because I have never looked closely enough to care. They were not my problem. They were not anyone's problem. That was the whole point. Then Calver sent the signal. I should tell you about Calver because none of what follows makes sense without him. He was a counselor from the Velnari aquatic territories, young by any species standard, brilliant in the way that makes other brilliant people nervous. He had been assigned to the human observation desk 14 years ago as a junior analyst, which most people in the conclave consider the least prestigious posting available. He did not see it that way. While other analysts filed their quarterly reports and moved on to more interesting duties, Calver read everything. 800 years of surveillance data. Every scrap of intercepted human communication that our listening stations had ever captured. Their history, their science, their art, their arguments, their disasters, and their recoveries. He taught himself 3 human languages. From intercepted media broadcasts, he built behavioral models so detailed that the conclave senior xenopsychologist quietly borrowed them, without crediting him. And then 4 months ago he walked into my office and told me dormancy accord was a moral catastrophe. I remember pouring myself a second cup of tea while he talked. I remember nodding in the practiced, non-committal way that one nods at someone who is passionate and wrong. He laid out his argument with genuine precision. Humans were suffering, he said. They were dying of diseases that conclave medicine had cured 2 centuries ago. They were fighting each other over resources that conclave technology could render irrelevant overnight. They were alone in a universe full of life, and no one had ever told them. And this, Calver said, leaning forward across my desk with those large, luminous Velnari eyes, was not caution. It was cruelty with a legal framework around it. I told him that the founders had reasons we might not fully understand. I told him that 800 years of consensus was not something to dismiss lightly. I told him that the accord existed because people far wiser than either of us had decided it should. He asked me if I had ever read the full accord preamble, not the summary, the original founding document written in the founders' own notation. I admitted that I had not. Most people hadn't. It was 600 pages of archaic formal language. The summary was 12 paragraphs and said essentially the same thing: leave the humans alone. Calver left my office looking like a person who had just made a decision. I did not understand what that look meant until the alarm went off. The breach report was 2 lines long. It told me everything and nothing at once. At 3:40 station time, a tight beam signal had been transmitted from Conclave Array 79 toward the human homeworld. The signal contained mathematical proof of intelligence, a greeting in 3 human languages, the conclave's coordinates, and an offer of peaceful contact. The transmitting entity, Counselor Calver of the Velnari delegation. The signal had already reached its destination. At the speed of light across the distance involved, Earth would receive it in 11 days. 11 days. I sat down very slowly in my chair and looked at the wall for a long time. In 42 years of service, I had never once thought of humans as something that could actually reach back. They were a data set, a quarterly report, a legal obligation. They were the subject of the oldest law in the galaxy because everyone agreed they should be left alone, and things that are left alone stay still. It had never occurred to me, not once, to ask what happens when something that has been sleeping finally wakes up. I pulled up the full dormancy accord preamble on my terminal, all 600 pages of it, and I started reading. I was still reading when the sun rose over the station's observation deck, and when I reached page 47, where the founders had written their private reasoning in uncharacteristically plain language, I understood for the first time why the alarm was the color of blood. The founders had not quarantined humanity because humans were violent. Almost every young species was violent. Violence was not the concern. They had quarantined humanity because every single simulation they ran, every predictive model, every projected scenario of first contact ended the same way. Not with humanity's defeat, not with humanity's absorption into the conclave. With the conclave's transformation, the founders had written in plain language on page 47, they do not conquer, they become, and then everything around them becomes something else too. I set down my tea. It had gone completely cold. Calver was arrested before the morning briefing. The legal proceedings would take months. I was assigned to write the incident report, which would be reviewed by 7 senior chambers before being archived in. A section of the conclave records that most ambassadors did not know existed. I wrote the report. I filed it. I stamped it urgent, which was a category I had never used before. Then I sat back in my chair and did the only thing left to do. I waited to see what 11 days would bring. The answer arrived in 9. Not 11. 9. I know because I was sitting at my desk when the receiving array flagged the incoming signal, and I looked at the timestamp twice because I thought there had been an error. The distance was not wrong. The speed of light had not changed. The humans had received Calver's message, processed it, debated it, reached a consensus, composed a reply, and transmitted it in 2 days fewer than our most optimistic projection allowed. The signal was clean, structured, encoded in one of the 3 human languages Calver had included in his greeting, with a mathematical header that our systems decoded in under 4 minutes. I called in our 3 best human language analysts. They sat around my table with the decoded text between them and said nothing for a very long time. The message was not what anyone had expected. There was no panic in it, no fear, no demand for explanation or proof. It did not begin with why or who are you, or are you real. It began with something far more unsettling. It began with we had hoped this day would come, and then it asked 17 questions. Not demands, not ultimatums. Questions, carefully worded, logically ordered, each one building on the last. They asked about the conclave's governing structure, its economic systems, its method of resolving disputes between member species. They asked how membership was determined and what obligations it carried. They asked whether the conclave's charter distinguished between species by developmental stage, and if so, by what criteria. They were not asking if we were friendly. They were asking how we worked. Analyst number 1, a quiet Methani, named Orvith, who had spent 30 years studying human communication patterns, looked up from the text and said something I have never forgotten. He said, they are not afraid. They are evaluating. I asked him how long he thought it had taken them to compose this message. He looked at the time stamp. He did the calculation. He said, at most 48 hours from receipt. I nodded slowly. I asked him what that meant. He said, it means they were ready. Not for us specifically, but for something like us. They have been thinking about this, perhaps for a very long time. I read the message a 4th time. Buried in the metadata of the signal, our analysts found something that had not been included intentionally. Or perhaps it had. It was difficult to tell, and that difficulty was itself alarming. Embedded in the transmission coding, in a layer that required significant technical sophistication to even detect, was a partial scan of the receiving array. Calver's signal had bounced off Before reaching Earth, they had reverse analyzed the signal path. They had identified the type of technology used to transmit it, and they had left that analysis sitting there in the metadata like a note left on a table, visible only to someone who knew to look. Analyst number 3, a young Viscari named Frel who specialized in xenotechnology assessment, stared at the metadata analysis for 11 minutes without speaking. Then she said, "They have already started working out how we built the transmitter from a single received signal. In 48 hours, I pushed back from the table and walked to the window outside the station's central atrium, hummed with its usual afternoon traffic. Counselors moving between chambers, diplomatic aides carrying documents, a group of MEV Tholi tourists photographing the view of open space through the observation glass. Everything looked exactly the same. I had a feeling standing there that it would never be exactly the same again. The emergency conclave session was called for the following morning. 41 species represented, every senior ambassador in attendance. The human response was read aloud in full. The 17 questions were projected on the chamber's main display, one by one. The room was very quiet for a very long time after the last question appeared. Elder Counselor Vane, the oldest living being in the conclave and one of only 3 individuals who had personally reviewed the full dormancy accord preamble within the last century, spoke. First, she said the founders feared exactly this. Someone toward the back of the chamber asked, "Feared what precisely?" The questions are entirely reasonable. They are diplomatic. They are measured. Vane said, "Yes. That is what the founders feared." The chamber went quiet again. In my report that evening, I wrote 3 sentences and then sat looking at them for a long time before submitting. I wrote, "The human response arrived ahead of schedule. It demonstrates no fear. It demonstrates significant preparedness. I do not know how to categorize what I observed in the chamber today because every senior ambassador in the conclave, representatives of 41 species with a combined 10,000 years of collective diplomatic experience, left the session looking like people who had just understood a joke they had been told 800 years ago and only now finally heard the ending. I deleted the last part before submitting, but I kept thinking it. Calver was still in his holding chamber. I was not authorized to visit him, but I did authorize a copy of the human response to be delivered to his cell, because he had earned the right to see it whatever else came next. I heard through a colleague who had authorized the delivery that he read it twice, sat quietly for several minutes, and then asked if he could have a pen and paper to begin drafting his testimony for the tribunal. I was told he was smiling. I did not know then whether that was hopeful or alarming. Looking back, I think it was both. The first human delegation arrived at Conclave Station 7 in a vessel that our docking authority refused to classify for 3 days because it did not match any recognized ship configuration in our registry. It was not elegant. It was not sleek. It was not what any of us had pictured when we imagined, however briefly, that we would one day receive a human spacecraft at a conclave port. It looked like something that had been assembled with whatever was available, which we would later learn was almost exactly what had happened. They had built it in 11 months. From scratch, using a combination of existing human, aerospace technology and theoretical principles they had reverse engineered. From Calver's signal. 11 months. I sat in on the technical review session, where our engineers analyzed the vessel. I watched 3 of the most decorated propulsion specialists in the conclave stand in front of the schematics in complete silence for 4 minutes. Then one of them, a gruff Dervani named Sten, who had never, in my experience, expressed anything resembling surprise, said quietly to no one in particular, "They shouldn't have been able to do this." The second engineer said, "They did it anyway." Sten said, "I know." There was a pause. Sten said, "I want to meet them." That was not a reaction I had anticipated from Sten. I should describe the delegation itself, because the delegation was its own kind of statement. 5 people, not a fleet, not an army, not a government official flanked by advisors and security in the full ceremonial weight of a species making its entrance onto the galactic stage. 5 people. Their lead diplomat was a woman named Dr. Amara Osei. She was perhaps 50 years old by human reckoning, with close-cropped silver hair and a manner so composed it was almost architectural. She walked off the docking ramp and into the conclave station as though she had been walking through conclave stations her entire life. She looked around the atrium. She looked at the species gathered to observe the arrival. She nodded once as though confirming something she had already known, and then she turned to the nearest conclave official and said, in careful but accurate Velnari, which was not one of the languages in Calvor's original message, "Where do we begin?" The Velnari official, a very senior diplomat named Counselor Ash, who had been composing herself for this moment for 3 weeks, lost her composure entirely for approximately 4 seconds before recovering. I watched this happen from 20 m away and felt something I had not felt in a professional context for many years. I felt genuinely curious. I had been assigned as the human delegation's primary conclave liaison. This had been framed to me as a compliment. I suspected it was being framed incorrectly, but I accepted the role because refusing would have required a reason, and the honest reason, which was that I found the whole situation deeply disorienting and would have preferred to watch from a comfortable distance, was not the kind of reason senior ambassadors put in writing. I introduced myself to Dr. Osei at the first formal meeting. I extended my secondary manipulator limb in the greeting position appropriate to her species, which I had reviewed in Calvor's behavioral files. She looked at it for exactly 1 second, then clasped it with both of her hands in a gesture I did not recognize, but which conveyed warmth so clearly that I did not need to recognize it. She said, "Ambassador Ivrath, I've read your quarterly reports on our world, all 672 of them." I said after a pause, "How?" She said, "We accessed the conclave's outer observation array after we decoded the signal architecture. The reports were in the 3rd archive level. They weren't encrypted." I said they weren't encrypted because no one expected anyone to be looking. She smiled. She said, "We noticed." The rest of the delegation was equally precise in their own disciplines. Their linguist, a young man named Oliver Crane, had in the 11 months between Kelver's signal and their departure. Memorized functional working vocabulary. In 4 conclave languages. Not phrases. Vocabulary. The ability to construct original sentences. 4 languages. In 11 months. Alongside building a spacecraft. Their economist, a quiet and intensely focused woman named Claire Maddox, arrived with a 400-page document that she described simply as a framework. It was a full economic integration, analysis for Earth's inclusion in the conclave trade network, including projected benefits, resource exchange, models, and identified inefficiencies, the existing conclave system that could be corrected. She had built it using publicly available conclave economic data that she had pulled from the same outer observation array. She handed copies to 6 senior economic counselors on her first day and asked if they had questions. They had many questions. Most of them were about how she had obtained certain figures that were not technically in the public data. She explained her methodology politely and completely. 3 of the counselors quietly asked for contact information before the meeting was over. Their engineer, a tall, quiet man named George Arden, said almost nothing in formal sessions. He spent his first week asking for access to the station's propulsion, research archives, and then disappearing into a reading room for hours at a time. What he was doing in there, I did not learn until the 3rd week, when he submitted a formal technical proposal to the conclave's engineering council. It contained 6 refinements to existing conclave faster-than-light field generation technology. 2 of them were things our engineers had been trying to solve for 40 years. And their doctor, a woman named Dr. Nina Harlow, walked into the conclave medical division on day 2 with a small case of samples and a calm expression and said, "I would like to talk to your chief epidemiologist about something I noticed in your published disease registry." She had noticed that 3 interspecies illnesses which the conclave listed as chronic and incurable shared a structural characteristic with a class of pathogens that human medicine had learned to address. She was not certain her methods would translate across the relevant biologies. She was very certain it was worth trying. The chief epidemiologist, who had been working on one of those 3 illnesses for 18 years, said yes before Nina Harlow had finished her sentence. I sat in on the first formal negotiation session between the human delegation and the conclave's admissions committee. I had expected the humans to make requests, resources, technology, formal recognition, perhaps territorial rights, the usual opening positions of a species seeking membership in a larger body. They made no requests. They presented instead a single document. It was not a demand. It was not a treaty draft. It was, Dr. Osei explained, a statement of intent. And the intent was this: humanity wished to be present at every table where decisions were made that affected their world and their species. They did not wish to be protected or elevated or guided. They wished to be involved. One senior counselor asked what they were offering in exchange for this involvement. Dr. Osei looked at him for a moment. She said, "We are already offering things. You have already received them. Your economists have the integration framework. Your engineers have George's proposals. Your medical division has Nina's pathogen analysis. We have not asked for anything yet Another counselor said those were gestures of good faith. Dr. Osai said pleasantly they were demonstrations of what good faith looks like when it's serious. The room was quiet for a moment. A counselor from the MEV Thale delegation, a species not known for warmth, said slowly, "You arrived here with an agenda already prepared. You knew what you wanted before you received our invitation." Dr. Osai said, "We have been thinking about this for a long time." The counselor said, "You did not know we existed until 2 months ago." Dr. Osai said, "We knew something like you existed. We have been thinking about what we would do if we ever found it." For a long time after that meeting, I sat in my office and thought about that sentence. Not the content of it, the tense of it. "We have been thinking," she had said. Not "we thought" once the signal came. Not "we quickly decided." We have been thinking. Past continuous. An action begun in the past and continuing into the present. They had been preparing for a conversation that, as far as they knew, they might never get to have. They had been working out the answer to a question they didn't know would ever be asked. That, I thought, was either the most human thing I had ever heard, or it was the most alien. I wasn't sure there was a difference anymore. The moment I remember most clearly from the first month did not happen in a negotiation chamber. It didn't happen in a technical briefing or a formal reception. It happened on a Tuesday morning, station time, in a corridor outside the conclave's archival wing. I was walking to a committee meeting. Elder Vane was walking in the opposite direction. She was the oldest living being in the conclave, a small and ancient Velskari, who had been senior counselor since before I was born and who had, in all my years of service, spoken to me personally perhaps 4 times. She stopped me. She said without preamble, "I asked to meet privately with Dr. Osei this morning." I said I was not informed of that meeting. She said it wasn't in any schedule. I waited. She said I wanted to apologize to her on behalf of the conclave for the accord, for 800 years of silence while they suffered things we could have helped with. I said, "How did she respond?" Vane was quiet for a moment. She said she thanked me. She said she understood why we were cautious. She said fear of the unknown was something humanity understood very well. And then she asked me if the conclave might be open to discussing the 3 oldest unsolved humanitarian crises on the human homeworld, because she had a framework for addressing all 3 that she wanted a senior voice to review. There was a long pause. Vane said very quietly she came to receive an apology and left negotiating solutions. I didn't say anything. Vane said, "I think the founders were right to be concerned, and I think they were completely wrong about what to do." Then she walked away down the corridor, and I stood there for a moment, and then I went to my committee meeting, but I did not hear a single word of it. I was thinking about Dr. Amara Ose, sitting across from the oldest being in the galaxy, accepting an 800-year apology with grace and immediately, without pause, redirecting the conversation toward something useful. I was thinking about page 47 of the Founders' document. They do not conquer. They become. And then everything around them becomes something else too. I was thinking that the founders had been right about the shape of the thing, but had made one critical error. They had assumed the transformation was something to be afraid of. I am writing this at my desk on the 4th anniversary of Calver's signal. Outside my window, the conclave station looks the same as it always has. The corridors are busy. The sessions are long. The paperwork is, if anything, worse. But 2 diseases that the conclave listed as chronic and incurable are no longer listed that way. George Arden's propulsion refinements have been implemented in 7 conclave research vessels and have reduced travel times across 3 major shipping routes. Oliver Crane is now teaching a course in cross-species linguistics at the Conclave's Academic Institute, and there is a waiting list for enrollment that stretches 18 months into the future. The Velnari and the Dervani have been in a territorial dispute for 200 years. Last month, Dr. Assay's economics team submitted a joint resource sharing framework that both species have agreed to review. They have been reviewing it together in the same room for 3 weeks. This is the longest they have voluntarily occupied the same room in recorded conclave history. I went to see Calver yesterday. He is still technically awaiting final sentencing, though the tribunal has delayed the decision 6 times now, which everyone agrees is pointed, but no one has said out loud. I brought him a copy of the proposed revision to the conclave charter, the first revision in 600 years. The section on new species membership no longer contains a developmental stay clause. It now contains instead a paragraph that the Velnari legal team drafted in consultation with Dr. Assay, and that reads in plain language: all species capable of meaningful engagement shall be considered capable of meaningful membership. Calver read the paragraph twice. He folded the document and held it in his hands for a moment. He said, I didn't know if it would work. I said, it hasn't fully worked yet. He said, no, but it's working. I said, yes. He said, was it worth it? I thought about Vane crying in a private chamber. I thought about Sten, the engineer, asking to meet a human. I thought about 3 weeks of voluntary shared meetings between species who had not agreed on anything in 2 centuries. I thought about 2 diseases that were no longer on the incurable list. I said, ask me again in another 4 years. But I was already thinking, yes. I was already thinking, the founders feared the transformation, and they weren't wrong to take it seriously. But they forgot one thing. A galaxy that cannot change is not a stable galaxy. It is a waiting one. Humans didn't wake us up. They reminded us that we had been waiting and showed us what it looked like to stop. Calver is being sentenced tomorrow. I will be there. The full chamber will be there. And whatever comes next, whether formal censure or something none of us have admitted to hoping for, I will stand in the chamber and know one thing clearly. The fool who ignored the elders was the first person in 800 years who actually read them carefully enough to disagree. And he was right. The sentencing chamber held 2,000 people. I had attended 100 proceedings in that room over the course of my career. I had watched treaties ratified, crimes adjudicated, new members welcomed. I thought I understood what the room felt like when something significant was happening. I was wrong. I had never understood it until that morning. Calver stood at the center of the chamber floor in the traditional Position of the accused, alone without counsel as Velnari legal custom required. He was smaller than I remembered, or perhaps the room was larger. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the tribunal panel within. Expression I can only describe as ready. Not resigned. Not afraid. Ready. Like someone who has been waiting for a door to open and has decided to be composed when it does. The chamber was so quiet I could hear the ventilation systems in the ceiling. Lead Tribunal Judge Orenval, a Dervani of considerable age and considerably more reputation, read the formal charge in full. It took 9 minutes. Unauthorized transmission. Violation of the Dormancy Accord. Breach of Conclave Charter Article 1. Section 1, the oldest and most foundational rule in 600 years of collective law. Guilty on all counts. There was no dispute about this. Kaelver had transmitted the signal. He had known it was illegal. He had done it anyway. The question was not whether he had done it. The question was what it meant that he had been right. Orenval looked at Kaelver for a long moment after reading the charge. Then she asked him if he wished to make a statement before the sentence was delivered. Kaelver said, "I do." He said it so quietly that the chamber's amplification system had to catch up with him. His voice, when it filled the room, was steadier than I expected. He said, "I want to be precise about something because I think the details matter. I did not break the Dormancy Accord because I thought I was smarter than the founders. I broke it because I had read the accord completely, including the founding documents and the private reasoning, and I concluded that the founders' intent had been overtaken by time. They were afraid of transformation. I understand that fear. Transformation is uncertain. But 800 years of certainty had produced a galaxy in which we watched people suffer and called our watching caution. I decided I could not continue to be part of that. I accept the consequences of that decision. I ask only that the tribunal consider, in its deliberation, whether a law that required us to look away deserved 800 more years of our protection. Then he was quiet. The chamber was quiet. Orenval looked at him for another long moment. She looked at the panel beside her. She looked at the full chamber, 2,000 beings representing 41 species, every one of them silent. Then she read the sentence. Kaelver was found guilty on all charges. His formal record would carry the conviction. He would be removed from his counselor position, and he would be required to complete community service in the newly formed Human Conclave Integration Office, which he would lead. The chamber did not stay quiet after that. I have been in that room for many significant moments. I have never heard it sound the way it sounded then. Not cheering exactly. Something more complicated than cheering. Something that contained relief and uncertainty and humor and grief all at once, and underneath all of it a long, slow exhale, like a breath that had been held for 800 years, finally being let out. Kaelver looked up at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked across the chamber at the section where the human delegation was seated. Dr. Ase was watching him. She gave one small, precise nod. He nodded back. I had been asked to give testimony before the sentence was delivered, and I want to tell you what I said because it was the most honest thing I have said in 42 years of diplomatic service. The tribunal had asked me, in formal language, to assess whether the awakening of humanity had damaged the conclave. I stood at the testimony podium. I thought about damage. I thought about the diseases removed from the incurable list. I thought about George Arden's propulsion design sitting in our engineering archives for 40 years as an unsolved problem and being solved 3 weeks by a man who had never studied conclave physics. I thought about the Vilnari and the Dervani in the same room. I thought about Vane crying. I thought about 600 years of a charter that no one had dared to touch, being touched carefully and seriously by people who had been members for 4 months. I thought about sitting at my desk on the morning of the alarm, reading page 47, feeling the cold weight of the founder's warning and understanding at last what they had seen. They do not conquer. They become. And then everything around them becomes something else too. And I thought, yes. I said yes. The awakening of humanity damaged the conclave. The chamber was very attentive. I said it damaged what the conclave was, a body that maintained its form by refusing to change, that called its stillness wisdom, that filed quarterly reports on suffering and stamped them dormant. That damage is real, and it is permanent, and I do not believe it is recoverable. What the conclave was cannot be restored. I paused. I said, it has not yet finished building. What the conclave will be, that process is ongoing. It is uncertain, and it is loud, and it involves significantly more paperwork than the previous system required. But I have watched 2 species that hated each other for 200 years sit in the same room and read the same document. I have watched 3 diseases reclassified. I have watched the oldest being in the conclave apologize for the first time in her recorded history and received that apology handled with more dignity than the occasion demanded. I have watched a young man from an aquatic world stand alone in this chamber and say plainly that he could not continue to look away, and I have watched this room full of the oldest and most experienced diplomatic minds in the known galaxy fail entirely to disagree with him. I looked at the tribunal. I said, I believe the question is not whether we have been damaged. I believe the correct question is whether we were functional before. And I no longer think we were. We were stable, which is not the same thing. I stepped back from the podium, and then the session moved on to the sentencing, and you already know what happened there. I want to tell you about the first full conclave session with Earth as a formal member, because it was the day I stopped writing reports the way I used to write them. Dr. Amara Osei was given the floor to address the full chamber as Earth's first official conclave voice. She stood at the central podium without notes. She looked at 41 species represented in the seats above her. She took one breath. She said, we spent a long time wondering if anyone was out there, not just scientifically, not just as a research question. We wondered the way you wonder about something that matters to you, the way you wonder whether you are alone, not just in a room, but in the universe itself. And the answer when it came was not what any of us expected, not because it was frightening, but because it was you. She paused. She said, we learned that you had been watching us for 800 years, that you had made a rule in your oldest law that we were not to be spoken to. We learned this and we had to decide what to feel about it. We chose to feel that you were afraid. And that fear we understand. We have been afraid of new things our entire history. We have made rules to protect ourselves from things we did not yet know. We understand the shape of that impulse perfectly, she said, but we were more afraid of something else. We were more afraid of the idea that you had decided we were not worth knowing, that the silence meant dismissal rather than caution. We are grateful that it was caution, and we hope that what you have seen in the past 4 months has changed the calculation. She across the full chamber. She said, we are not here to replace what you have built. We are here because you built something worth joining, and we intend to be worth the invitation. She stepped back. The chamber was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. And then Elder Vane, who had not spoken in an open session in 11 years, pressed her indicator and was recognized by the chair and said simply, welcome. And that was that. What happened in the months and years after that session is harder to compress into words that do justice to the scale of it, but I will try because I think the details matter. Humans adapted. That was the word most commonly used in the early reporting. But adaptation implies adjustment, fitting oneself into an existing shape. What humans actually did was more specific and more interesting than that. They engaged relentlessly, comprehensively, without apparent awareness that there were topics they were not supposed to raise or questions they were not expected to ask. Oliver Crane published Across Species linguistic analysis that identified 3 significant translation errors in the conclave's formal treaty language, errors that had been in place for over a century, errors that when corrected changed the legal interpretation of 2 standing agreements in ways that 2 member species immediately recognized as significant. The corrections were adopted. The treaty language was revised. This was the first formal revision of standing conclave treaty text in 60 years. It happened in week 7 of Humanities membership. Claire Maddox's economic integration framework, the one she had presented on day 1, in which several counselors had received with polite skepticism, was formally adopted in modified form by the Conclave's Trade Commission in month 3. The modifications were mostly technical. Adjustments for species-specific resource requirements. The core framework was unchanged. In the first 6 months of its implementation, it produced measurable efficiency improvements in the 3 major interspecies trade routes that had been operating at reduced capacity for decades. The Dervana trade minister, a being not known for personal warmth, sent Claire Maddox a formal commendation. She framed it and put it in her office window. George Orton's propulsion refinements were tested, certified, and installed in the Conclave's research fleet. The 2 designs that our engineers had been unable to solve for 40 years were both based on principles so straightforward that after George explained them, several of our propulsion specialists spent a week examining their own archives to understand how they had missed them. The consensus was that they had been looking at the problem from a single disciplinary direction and had not thought to approach it from a different angle. George, when this was explained to him, said thoughtfully that humans had spent centuries working on problems with insufficient resources, which had forced them to get creative about angles. This was recorded in the conclave's engineering literature as a contribution to methodology, which was, as far as I am aware, the first time a human approach to problem solving had been cited in conclave academic literature. It would not be the last. Dr. Nina Harlow's pathogen work took longer because biology is more patient than engineering or economics. But at the 14-month mark, she and the conclave's chief epidemiologist published a joint paper on a treatment approach that showed significant results against one of the three chronic interspecies illnesses. Clinical trials began immediately. Results were preliminary and required years of further work, but the chief epidemiologist, who had been studying that illness for 18 years, told me privately that it was the most significant development in the entire history of the disease's treatment. He said it with the particular kind of wonder that belongs to people who have worked on something for a very long time and had begun to doubt the work would ever yield anything. I asked him what made the difference. He said she looked at it from the patient's side rather than the pathogen side. She started with the question of what the patient needed to survive rather than the question of what made the pathogen dangerous. It sounds obvious, but we had not done it that way. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about how many things we had not done because we had always done them another way, and the other way was fine. And fine has a gravity to it that is very hard to escape once you've settled into it. The cultural impact was harder to measure and more difficult to explain to people who had not been present for it. Human art circulated through the conclave's communication networks with a speed that our cultural analysts had not predicted, not because it was pushed, because it was found. Beings across the conclave encountered human music, human visual art, human literature, and responded to it in ways that were specific and personal and not reducible to trend or fashion. The Velnari, a species with a rich tradition of narrative oral culture, discovered human fiction and specifically human stories about endurance, stories about people who face things larger than themselves and continued anyway. These stories resonated with the Velnari so deeply and so quickly that within 8 months of first contact, 4 Velnari cultural institutions had established formal programs for translating human literature into Velnari notation. One of those institutions declared an annual observance honoring the tradition of stories about hope, citing specific human narrative works as their inspiration. They called it the Waking Day. They named it after the day Calver's signal arrived. I did not tell Calver about the Waking Day until several months after it was established. When I did, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't know they were listening to us either." I said, "We all were. We just weren't allowed to." The Emiphthali, a species entirely without a humor response, had what their own cultural ministry described as a systematic encounter with human comedy. Human comedy, as it turns out, does not require a humor response to land. It requires recognition of incongruity. The Emiphthali are extraordinarily attuned to logical inconsistency, which is, at its most fundamental level, the engine of comedy. Within a year, the most widely distributed MEV Thole cultural export was a set of analytical commentaries on human comedic structure. These commentaries were unintentionally extremely funny. The irony was noted by everyone except the MEV Thole, who considered the observation imprecise. In my own professional life, things changed in ways that were smaller but no less significant to me personally. I stopped filing quarterly dormancy reports because there was no longer anything to report as dormant. My office took on 3 human consultants in month 6. One of them, a young man named Peter Wade, had been trained in conclave administrative law at Oliver Crane's Linguistic Institute and was technically more current on conclave legal precedent than 2 of my existing staff. He was 26 years old. He made excellent tea. He also, in his first month, identified an administrative redundancy in the conclave's ambassador authorization process that had been processing delays for 30 years and submitted a correction proposal that was approved in 2 weeks. I told him this was unprecedented. He said it seemed like an obvious fix. I said that's usually how the best fixes seem in retrospect. He looked at me seriously and said, "Ambassador, is it always like this? The bureaucracy." I said it used to be worse. He said, "I can't imagine worse." I said, and I meant it, you helped make it better. There were shadows, of course. Things are always more complicated than a celebratory account suggests, and I want to be honest here because the honest version is more interesting than the simplified one. Not every conclave species welcomed the shift with equal grace. Several member states whose internal governance structures relied on a degree of insulation from external scrutiny found that human journalists who were constitutionally incapable of treating opacity as a virtue had identified this insulation with precision and were writing about it with equal precision. Publications that now circulated through conclave networks. The word accountability entered the formal vocabulary of 6 conclave species that had no previous equivalent term. This was uncomfortable for some parties and clarifying for others, and the process of sorting out which was ongoing. 3 conclave member states formally requested that the conclave's admissions committee review the terms of human membership on the grounds that the engagement was more disruptive than anticipated. The committee reviewed this request. Dr. Oss submitted a 40-page response to the review. The 3 member states withdrew their request before the full review was completed. I do not know exactly what was in those 40 pages. I asked Peter Wade, who had helped format them. He said with his characteristic directness it was mostly math. Cale Vore took up his leadership of the Human Conclave Integration Office with a focus that reminded me of why I had privately found him alarming in the first place. He was not content to manage the existing programs. He expanded them. He identified 12 additional areas where human expertise and conclave resources could be combined to address problems that both sides had been unable to solve independently. He scheduled a meeting for every Tuesday at the 9th hour with representatives from every species delegation that was willing to attend. Within 4 months, 32 of 41 delegations had standing representatives at the Tuesday meetings. The 2 delegations who did not attend sent their regrets and asked to receive the meeting minutes. I went to the 9th Tuesday meeting. I sat in the back. I watched Kale Vor run the room with an ease that had not been there before his arrest, as though the certainty of having done the right thing had removed some friction from his motion. I watched human representatives and conclave representatives talk to each other about problems and solutions with the specific energy of people who have realized they have more in common than either had expected. I stayed for the whole meeting. I went back the following Tuesday, and the one after that. I want to end with a moment rather than a summary, because I think things that summaries miss. It was a morning about 3 years after Dr. Ase's arrival at the station. I was walking to my office through the central atrium, the same atrium where I had stood watching the ordinary traffic on the morning the alarm first sounded, thinking the galaxy looked the same as always. I heard something and looked up. 2 children were chasing each other around the base of the atrium central sculpture. One was human, a girl perhaps 8 years old with bright eyes and a habit of laughing too loudly, which I had noticed before because she came to the station often with her parent, one of the integration office's human coordinators. The other was Velnari, the child of a Velnari diplomatic aide, perhaps equivalent in age. Velnari children are quieter than human children as a general rule, but this one was not quiet. This one was running and shouting something in a mixture of Velnari syllables and human vowels that had no clean translation, but communicated with total clarity that they were having a wonderful time. Neither of them knew and could not have been expected to know that 800 years of law had been written specifically so that this would not happen. Neither of them knew that the galaxy had spent centuries holding its breath around their shared existence. They only knew each other and the sculpture's base and the game. I watched them for 3 minutes. I did not file a report about it. I did not note it in any official record. I kept it for myself, which is something I was not trained to do and which I have come to understand the humans were very much trained to do. To keep the moments that mattered, to hold them somewhere where analysis cannot reach them. The galaxy is louder than it used to be. It is less certain. It is more argued over and more carefully examined and more honest about its own failures than it was when I started my career. It is messier. Problems that were stamped dormant for decades are now opened and debated, and sometimes solved and sometimes solved wrongly and corrected, and sometimes solved wrongly again in a different direction, and the process of getting to something right is noisier than the previous system. The previous system was very quiet, and in its quiet it looked away. I am 61 years old. I have been an ambassador for 42 of those years. I have filed 704 quarterly reports over the course of my service, and I expect to file more before I am done. Most of them are about procedures and protocols and the ordinary business of a galaxy that is learning slowly and imperfectly and with great enthusiasm to know itself. I think about the founders sometimes. I think about what they saw that made them write what they wrote on page 47. I think they were right about the fact of it. I think they were looking at something real, but I think they made their decision the dark in the first hours of a thing they did not understand, and they chose to keep the lights off because they were afraid of what they might see. Kale Vor turned the lights on. It turns out the room has been full of people the whole time. And the view, I have come to understand, is extraordinary.